How's it going, everybody? You're listening to the Let's Talk podcast, the show that brings you the latest in relevant and current trends and conversations about our daily living, the Bible, and also some very fun and unexpected points of view. With your hosts, Joey Santos and Brad Wilson.
So, Brad Wilson, how you doing?
Just living the dream right now.
Living the dream. Tell me about what is the most, when it comes to teaching the Bible, what do you think is the most challenging subject to talk to the church about? Or what I'm sure there's like not just one, but what are the most, the top 2 or 3 for you that's like, this is hard ones to talk to the church about?
Well, no one likes to talk to the church about money. People don't like to talk to the church. No one likes to really talk about sex. It encompasses a lot of stuff. And, I mean, those two are probably up there because our culture is so saturated with both those things. And maybe a third one that's under the radar is, which kind of, I guess, encompasses all this stuff, is idolatry, which that's an old school term, word. I mean, it's all over the Bible, but I don't think we like talking about that because it is, everyone deals with it.
So let's go from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that a little bit. So what is about idolatry? And when you say it's churches don't like to talk about, is because people don't like to hear about it? And how idolatry fits into that?
Well, idolatry, to me, in simple terms, is it's something or some things we put in the place God needs to be, instead of Him. And I think the reason that in church we don't like to talk about it is because we don't want to have the complete conversation with it. Because when you look at the stuff with idolatry, all of us are. It's something that hits all of us, and sometimes we would rather just not talk about it because church tends to like to talk about things, and when we'd like to teach and do things in the church, we like to talk about things where we feel like, okay, I'm good in this area. But idolatry, I mean, all of us have things that we consistently put in the top place other than God. Like in our culture today, there's a big thing. People are like, well, I want to return to my family, right? Like I want my family to be together, and we often choose family, or we put family in a higher priority than we do God. Mm-hmm. It's just masked differently. And so it's like with everything. We're like, yeah, I'm going to be you look at things on Sunday. I've talked with my dad about this, of the where the church is at seems to be with culture. Like Sunday 20 years ago, Sunday would be considered sacred. I remember a year here, we were having Upward on Sunday afternoons, and you would have thought we took all the Bibles out of the chairs and burned them. I mean, some people were just not happy about it. They're like, you're cutting in the family time. Yet my question would be, well, if you're going to take that type of logic, when you go home, no TV, you should just be sitting together on the couch talking about what God's doing in your life, and don't go do anything else. So it can be very complicated.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Do you think, looking at history, and I start to look at the possibilities, like between 1960s and 80s, is a time when new Bible translations start to be introduced to us. And it's interesting because the language changed. So, for example, I think everybody was based on King James, and King James has a very specific way to address and to compel what the Bible is saying. Which if there's a formality to it, there's a sacred style, if you will, right? It's like there's some terminologies on the King James that becomes very sacred feel to how we read it. Well, between 60s and 80s, all these new translations start to be introduced to us, and it's kind of interesting because that evidently had an impact in the church, because as the language got modern, the churches start to modernize their styles, and I wonder how much of that impacted how we see culture, how we see community, how people behave towards change, because we can see that there's pros and cons on those changes, right? So right there is the rise of megachurch, as we know, and that's when church became worship styles start to change, because there's a change in language on how we communicate the gospel and how we talk about God, and and it's interesting to go back and analyze from a biblical perspective, from a simple fact of a translation.
Yeah.
Right? And how that actually had an impact in how we look at the gospel, and how we look at the Bible, and how we look at our lives. So, because you see, to me, it's such a fine line. If you tell me, well, family is important, you need to be a family man, you need to do this with your family, you need to do all these things with the family, and then all of a sudden, but am I turning my family into an idol? Is my family above God? So do you think the line is just too blur at this point for people to really understand what is idolatry and what is not?
I just think I think we don't talk about it enough. I think it's one of those things that's all throughout the Bible. So for us, when we think of an idol, we think of, let's go old school. Nebuchadnezzar builds the fiery furnace. He builds that idol, and people are worshiping it.
Yeah.
Like, that's what we think of idols. Or you've seen Gladiator, right?
Yes.
Remember when Maximus at the beginning, he's got those little wooden things? I mean, that's common for a lot of these people. So we think of an idol like, well, someone would be like, well, when I took a trip, I went on a vacation, down to the Caribbean, or like our resident cruise director, Jeremy Braley, at some of these stops, and people like, well, I bought this weird little statue from some adobe hut on the middle of nowhere, and it's up. We think of that as an idol, and I think that not teaching that, so people have this idea of they think of it like of an idol worship, of like we're bowing down or worshiping something, where it's much more. It's much more. Really, it's just anything that we put above God. Like sometimes in families, our kids in our culture can be put in that place. Sometimes in a marriage, we can put our spouse in that place. Sometimes it's our job. Sometimes it's a hobby, and so I think a lot of it is, it's not like when we hear idolatry or idol worship, we think of something very blatant and bad. And it happens, and it's typically not that. It's just getting our priorities out of balance, and a lot of times I don't think it's intentional, because as fathers, being the best dad we can be for our kids, that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's rooted in the Bible. It's just making sure that the awareness of, okay, I need to make sure I keep God in the place where He is, and that will drive everything. And I mean, the problem today is just for us. There's so many things going on. It's easy for that stuff to happen. But I think some of the teaching, and this goes along with the megachurch, is, and I don't know what you think about this, but building something up. You go to a lot of places, and the church, instead of pointing us towards God, it's like, hey, if you know God, here's 4 things over these next 4 weeks God will do to improve your
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
So it almost became churches got very good at the self-help.
Exactly,
opinion.
and that's like I was thinking about the fact that I think the church, it was almost like a misuse of the mission. Like God has this very specific mission for the church. To go make disciples. I mean, it cannot get any simpler. It is very simple. But I think throughout the time in the last 30 years, when you look at it, the church has become almost this like social justice agent. So we move people from their spiritual side only, in terms of, look, we're going to form your character based on the spiritual attributes that God gave us through the Bible. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn into this more like a practical use of that by getting involved in social causes, by getting involved in the social justice issues. And by doing that, I think by default, I think the church got involved in something that should not get involved in the first place. That's the politics of our society. And I think that's when we start losing the mission of it. I think just look at the church, just lost the purpose. Lost is, and I think, I think that's the biggest challenge for the church today. Not you. We had Kevin preach this past Sunday at the bar, and he asked a question that caused quite a bit of reaction in the room because it turned political pretty fast, right? About helping the poor and how we do this. And all of a sudden, people pick sides on a simple question about helping the poor.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was interesting because as they are having the discussion, I was like, hold on a second, time out. If you realize, we tend to see things today based on whatever lenses we choose to put in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
So we have this set of lenses that we wear, and we keep put them up and down. Well, this time I want to use this lens here, and I want to see through this lenses, and that's how I'm going to form my opinion.
Yeah.
That's how I'm gonna make my decisions. Instead of, when you look at those lenses, you start to realize it's not just God the only way I'm seeing things through. It's all these other things that, in reality, the church has put in place of God. So, in reality, to me, that's like a self-evaluation of the church here. Like, have we just drifted too far from the simple gospel, and we actually allow people to build idols through the way we've been teaching the Bible, the way we're conducting our weekend experiences, the way we've been leading people. And I think the big church, the big C church, it starts to wake up to that. Because it's like, oh man, this doesn't seem that this is working anymore. I think we talked about this before. I think COVID helped to lift that curtain and allow people to see that, like, okay, that's not working. This is not church. And we start to grab the reality. But I think it's good for people to think about that. Like, it's something we got to talk about. We don't talk about in church. It's easy to miss. Like you said, it's easy to miss because we idol is no longer the thing that we just put on the wall and worship. But idol can be the smallest things in your life that's actually
Idol
taking priority over
politics.
Yep. There we go.
I mean, that's another thing, they always said growing up, don't talk religion and politics.
Yeah.
Unless you want to have a successful syndicated radio show, then talk it. And then people will just tune in all the time.
Yeah. No, it is. Okay, the next one up is sex. Let's talk about sex.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I can tell you were a Salt and Pepper fan back in the day. I mean,
Well, that got PG-13 pretty fast.
yeah. Well, I was gonna say earlier too with the King James thing. I'm like, we need to consult Baumline and Dale Reeves because let's be honest,
I know. Yeah, he's
we're-
not from our era.
you were just a little Padawan on the Brazilian beaches, and I wasn't even walking the earth yet. Those guys were in their prime. But that's another podcast. I think with that is it's just something where I don't know. No one wants to talk about it because everyone feels awkward, and yet that has been wreaking havoc in our world since day one. I mean, you go and look in the garden, and all of a sudden that once they realize this stuff, they're like, well, we better make some loincloth out of some leaves and some other stuff. So I mean, Fruit of the Loom was crafted in the garden right after they ate from the tree. And if you look at stuff throughout history, how much does how many situations and things does that wreak havoc with? And you look in our culture today, I mean, that's a huge selling point. It's a huge selling point with everything about it. And so, like, we look at the statistics. I remember a couple years ago, probably one of a number of sermons I've preached in my life. One of the most uncomfortable is we did this series on just kind of like hot topics and stuff in the culture, and I had to talk about pornography. And I was the Sunday to preach that. One of them I had to preach in the chapel. And you want to talk about a weird situation. It's like you're going in there, you're talking about this topic, and you're looking around there, you're like, this is like me sitting down with my grandparents and be like, hey, let's have a discussion. Weird. But the statistics for that were just, it's just disturbing. And so it's almost like sometimes I think with the three in my household, 16, 14, and now 13, the going through and looking at phones and looking at stuff that they put out there and the stuff that's in the group chat. I mean, the kids are talking about all these things. And sometimes as parents, we think to ourselves, well, if I don't mention it, they're not going to talk about it. You're like, walk to schools. It's all over. It's
kind of interesting. Parents who want to pretend that these conversations are not happening. That my kids they're not gonna get involved in these conversations. It's not a matter if they want or not. They will be introduced to these conversations if you don't. And they're getting younger. Like the age that they're being introduced to this subject about sex and all variations that come with it. It's getting younger.
Yeah, it's all like the conversations. I think some parents would be mortified if they knew the conversations of, and I'm talking like, and it may even be younger than this, but fifth, sixth grade. It's all if you've got a student in sixth grade, they may not tell you the truth, but that's what people are talking about, and the terms and all the things there. And what's interesting about it is it used to be that you would think more of the conversation would be driven from the boys, the male side of it. And what's changed in culture is that's no longer the case. Like it's in both realms, and they're talking about it and for some reason it makes us, some people blush, some people get nervous, some people are like, well, we shouldn't talk about these things in church yet. It's a part of it's all over the place in the Bible, and now there's a way to there's a way to talk about it.
Yes.
But I mean, you see all that stuff Paul doesn't back away from talking about it within the churches because, man, you think about as the church was expanding and the cultures it's going into, I mean, it was prevalent all over the place. Yeah. For us, we're kind of like, well, if we don't talk about it, it'll just not happen.
Exactly. Let's come back to that. Let's come back and talk more about sex. What makes City Life Plus even more special and better all around is that it is for everyone. This platform has kids content, content for students, podcasts, music, and traditional content to help you grow as Christians. So there really is something for everyone on here. We hope you have had a chance to check it out. If not, please do. We'll be adding new material monthly and we'll post on the social media channels when we do, so make sure to subscribe and follow our social media channels so you know when new content is released. Okay, so Brad, let's just go back to that point. It's interesting because it's getting younger and parents are deceiving themselves if they don't really look at the fact that their kids, son or daughters, they are talking about it, they're hearing about it, they're learning from other people. Young people, fifth graders, sixth graders, they are. Here's the interesting thing though. I don't know what your experience has been counseling couples, but I would say have done this probably not as many times talking to couples in trouble like you have. I have probably my fair share. The number one reason couples come to a point of like conflict of separation, to me, in my conversations, the common denominator, always money has something to do, but really, right on top is intimacy, which is interesting to me how much couples don't want to talk about their sex life. And still, the reason why they end up separating is because one of those two are someplace else looking for that satisfaction somewhere else. And I think it really puzzles me is that let's not talk about it. Let's pretend it's not happening. I think we can manage by not talking until something like that happens, which many times, not always, but many times becomes irreversible in a marriage. So how do we fix that? Like, how do we get people to understand that it's okay to sit down and have a conversation about, let's talk about our sex life. Let's talk about our intimacy. Let's talk about, and why the church has become a place where we should never talk about it.
Yeah, that's a good question how it arrived there, but I just think some of it is the idea of, in the church. I remember going through Bible college, and one of the terms that you'd hear in the church is seeker sensitive. Like, are you a seeker sensitive church? And so the connotations of that meant that your music, you'd have guitars and drums, and your music was more upbeat, and the people would say, well, your messages are watered down, and basically you're just preaching, hope and dreams and grace and forgiveness, and just telling people, hey, it's all right that I get it, your life's a dumpster fire, but God can put that fire out, and then replace it with the Holy Spirit fire. So they would do these things, and then you'd have other people like, you know what, we're not growing because we're preaching the truth, the Word of God. Like, we're every Sunday we're bringing the hammer, we're stepping on your toes, we're running you over, and you look at that, and here's the common denominator: neither one of those places were talking about that stuff. Yet, like you said, as you get down to it, it's a huge driving force. Like, I was listening to a podcast today, and they were talking about I think was it Carl Lentz at Hillsong?
Yeah.
And Justin Bieber's pastor got all that trouble, and then it went from as they uncovered it, it just wasn't one thing. It was the guy was multiple things it shouldn't be, and it's like these there's with these relationships and the whole intimacy fact of it, there's a common denominator with it, and someone is seeking that intimacy from somewhere else. It's not, people don't say, well, you know what, I started talking to this person because it was just a great conversation. And they gave me great fantasy football strategy.
Yeah.
No one says that. And so with us wanting to be oblivious to it, it's one of those things where, like you said, I have no clue why we don't talk about it. Maybe we think people they won't come, they won't want to listen. But it's crazy, as you said, with it is once you get down to it, money factors into it, but that's always when you're dealing with couples, that is always once you unpack everything and kind of pull the curtain back a little bit, they're going to talk about that.
Absolutely. Well, let's go get on the closing arguments here. Talking about money, because that money, you said, is the top one. It's hard to talk about in church. We don't like to talk about in church. People run away. Usually, literally, people like, I'm not going to attend the next few weeks because they're going to talk about money. Why is money so hard for people to talk about in church? Why something that we're like, I want to talk about money. Don't talk to me about money. Are we just circling back to it's one of the idols?
Probably. And I don't know. I think money is, to your point, from a church perspective, we're like, okay, we don't want to run people off. You've heard from people that a common phrase. I guess I don't know how common it is, but people say, "Man, all the church wants is my money. All they talk about is my money." And so there's this tension, I think, with it of when we talk about it with people that, our money is it's for us, like you think about it, of paying bills, of purchasing food, of doing things. It's a lifeline. Like we need it to do things. We need it to function. And I think that people just, when they talk about it, they think, well, all the church wants is my money. And the problem with where a lot of us start from is the lack of realization that everything in the world, everything we have, it ultimately is it's God's. And I don't think we realize how much Jesus talked about it, probably how much he talked about it that wasn't even recorded. But then when you see things through the Bible, it may not see the idea of money, but part of this thing with God of recognizing that, what we have. I think the fact that we work jobs and we earn it sometimes confuses the situation, and we don't see it as, well, God's blessing me with this. But if we start from a biblical point of view, that's where it's at. But I think it goes back to like the other topic of the church is just they haven't wanted to talk about it, and so then when we do, sometimes it gets weird.
It is, and it's interesting because, for example, the very idea, like you said, of it's God's money, it's not mine. Yeah. Well, hold on. In a very practical way of looking at it, God didn't put that money in my bank account.
Exactly.
I had to get a job, I had to put my hours so that I can get the money in my bank account. Mm-hmm. So, do you think there's a need to change that terminology, not the principle of the concept, but I'm saying, do you think people just lost the reference? Do you think people just lost the biblical reference of what it means when the church say, all your possessions, all your money, everything you have belongs to God? Because it feels to me that for considering the fact that the people has walked away from church, church has been more empty than ever. Uh-huh. So here we are trying to push the same button over and over again. Not everything you have belongs to God. Everything you have. Do you think we're communicating this right to people?
I think we're trying to communicate it right, but I think of going back, and one of the things we talked about with God's command of making disciples, I think that part of the struggle we have is in our church's Big C Church. I don't think people really know the Bible, and I think that part of the stuff with the the growth of it is what we've allowed to set is, and even the challenge for us is the commitment that Jesus asks for is it's not a it's not a little commitment. It's I mean, he wants all of us, and I think it goes back to the intentionality of discipleship, and I think that's the thing we're seeing is discipleship has to be relationship based, and there has to be a focus, or you can't just do it for an hour on Sunday and think, okay, this stuff is going to happen. There's so much more to unpack and get into, and so I think in some regards the allure or the the one stop shop like in the mega churches. Hey, you can come here. We'll take care of your kids. You can do your service. Hey, we're gonna get you out of here on this time and what we're going through of the appealing things. And most people would think, man, if you're preaching all the time about, hey, man, if you're gonna follow Christ and you're gonna claim Jesus as your Lord and Savior, this is what it really means. Some people are like, yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna teach that all the time, but Jesus is like, hey, if you're following me, the whole idea of take up your cross or dying daily, that may not be the most appealing for some people, because I think we in our mind have thought, well, if we initially lower the expectations and make something that really sounds good, we'll get people in, and then they'll just move along. But I think now we're looking at something, and I think, like you've said, with what COVID did for us, we're like, wait a minute, this may have brought a lot of people in, but in today's culture, and then in today's world, a lot of those people, once COVID kind of threw a wrench in the system, a lot of those people they drifted out, or they're really trying to figure that stuff out.
Do you think it's kind of interesting because I hear you say that, and I think there's not much of appealing to the message, like personally, right? So that's like to be a disciple, pick up your cross and follow me. Self-sacrifice. Everything you have belongs to God. You're not the center of attention anymore. That's what God wants you to do. There's really nothing appealing about that. Appealing to the human being, right? So, which I think that's the tension. The tension is really in the fact that what are you going to give up in your life that you're putting us above God to follow God? But then let me ask a question. It's really like following God is something that's really not enjoyable. Because the things you described there, they don't sound enjoyable.
No, I think the conflict is the world says it's all about you. And when you do these things and take care of yourself, everything's going to be great. The creator of the world says, man, it's all about me. And when you realize that, and when you pursue me, then there's a freedom, there's a fulfillment that you'll never experience following the things of the world. We think, because that's what we're used to, that's what we're involved in, that's what we grow up, we think this stuff is good. But I think sometimes the struggle is if the things of like you look at people or you interact with people on how so many people's their happiness is based situationally, and their joy or their happiness is a situational happiness.
Yeah.
And depending on what happens determines what things look like for them. And what God offers is initially, and I mean, there's probably a reason that the Bible's clear. Hey, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to go down that wide road. They're just going to choose it because that sounds appealing to them. There's not going to be a whole lot of people that go the other way. But when you begin to kind of walk down that road and you start to experience the stuff that God would offer, that's why when people get there, I don't think they run from that or they move from it because like, okay, this is what I've been looking for. Otherwise, it's just a constant. We just continue to chase after something. And it's like, for instance, we joke around all the time with football, but like, look at the city, man. If Cincinnati would have lost to the Jets, there's people already right now, like they're already thinking to themselves, man, this season stinks. And you think of how crazy it is, like with our sports teams, is we don't get paid by them. We don't have any impact in the game, yet our mood and attitude is determined.
Oh, tell me about it.
By what these guys do, or the same thing of the later in the year, heading into end of November, December when the World Cup starts. There's probably going to be some of these people in these countries. I mean, they'll burn their country down if.
Oh, they will.
If they don't, like, this guy missed a PK, and they're like, and so when you look at this stuff and I think that's kind of the thing, like, God's message would be to a lot of us is like, okay, how long are you going to continue to allow stuff that's out of your control to determine just your happiness and outlook on things, or do you really want to take control of all that?
See, that's the thing, though. That's the way you describe that, which is exactly what I think people are looking for the most. They're looking for freedom. They're looking for fulfillment. They're looking for peace, joy. They're looking for happiness.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because God offers all those things. And I think that if there are ways for us to introduce this to the society in a way that they can actually grasp, because that's what they're looking for. And God offers all of it. He actually, like, right up front, here's what I'm going to give it to you if you follow my commands. Here's what I'm going to give to you if you practice what I told you to do. I'm going to give you all this. I'm going to give the security you're looking for. That doesn't come for free, though, because it takes away what you value the most, your ego.
Yeah.
And God knows. He's like, I'm going to take away the thing that you actually idolize the most, yourself. And I really think that's the secret sauce. I think teaching the Bible, teaching that truth, it doesn't have to be in a way that's depressing. Yeah. It doesn't have to be in a way that's sad. It doesn't have to be in a way that's brings condemnation, because it's not.
Yeah. It's
really actually something for people to celebrate, to rejoice. I mean, the Bible talks about that. We rejoice in it. So I think it is. I think that's the challenge. But we're fighting against it. It's kind of, we're not literally. Almost to me, it feels like we're not fighting against the enemy. We're fighting against people's egos. Because if that can be removed out of the way, that's what the devil uses the most. If that can be removed, if people can actually open their eyes and say, okay, actually there's a way for me to find freedom in my life. There's a way for me to find joy, peace, self-control, right? I mean, you can go down the list. I can have those things. All I have to do is to really, really follow God. And the number one thing for me to do is to remove myself, my ego. When say remove your ego out of the way and allow God to do it. I think that's a powerful thing. And I think if you're concerned about money, talk about everything come to place when you behave like that and allow God to operate. Because money is no longer the thing that drives you. God is. And I think if people really would embrace God's mission and calling, people would make a lot of money for the mission, for the purpose. Like, they would just like, okay, I see it. I believe in God. I trust God. I accept Christ. I'm on a mission, and I'm a gifted person on business. I can make a lot of money. Like, think about that combination.
Yeah.
Think about the number of people that we have around us. Church, society, our circle of influence.
Mm-hmm.
If they really had a deep relationship with God and Christ and decide to surrender everything to Him and surrender their talents and their gifts and said, you know what, I'm going to make money and I'm going to really pour into what God's doing. And let me be very clear. I'm not saying pour all their money in church. I'm not saying that, right? I know Pat Gilsinger, he's now the CEO of E12, and he said it. He said his plan when he started working, his plan was that one day I want to give 50% of my income to God. And that's exactly what he does today. 50% of his income goes to God. And it's not a small money, right? I mean, the guy's the CEO of Intel.
Yeah.
So I think that is the powerful thing to me is that mindset. The guy's fully devoted to Christ, got a high position of influence, and his goal was like, I want to be successful, I want to make money, and I want to dedicate it to God. So I think there's a lot for people to chew on this and reflect on it. But man, it was a great conversation. But we have to go because the producers already make all kinds of signs.
Yeah.
That I'm so glad he's not on camera. He's just ready to roll. He's really busy in a little room there telling us to stop. But we'll be back next week with more from Let's Talk Podcast. Got plans for this weekend?
There's a big showdown in local football in the Greater Miami Conference.
Oh, really?
Undefeated Lakota West in the GMC versus undefeated Mason.
There we go.
In the GMC Friday night Lakota West. This is the battle for first place.
It's gonna be big.
We'll see if the Comets can do their thing.
Well, we'll see. I'm not into football, but I'm glad you give people heads up what's coming.
I know they appreciate it.
I'll cheer for you.
I appreciate that.
Well, have fun. I'll see you next week.
All right, see you, dude.
Thanks for joining us this week on Let's Talk Podcast. Make sure to check us out at ccliveplus.com, where you can listen to past episodes and subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast platforms. And one more thing. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a rating on iTunes and tell someone about the show. Until next time.